The notification came at 6:47 inches the morning, while I was still sitting at the kitchen table with my first cup of coffee. My phone buzzed against the wood, and I picked it up the way I always do, out of habit more than urgency. I'm 63 years old. I've learned that most things that feel urgent in the morning aren't. But this one was. A withdrawal alert from my savings account, $420, pending. I hadn't made any withdrawal. I hadn't touched that account in 11 days. I set my coffee down slowly, the way you do when your body understands something before your mind is ready to catch up. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the house. My wife was still asleep upstairs. Her brother was in the guest room down the hall, had been for 7 months now, though we'd agreed on 6 weeks when this whole arrangement started. I opened the banking app and looked at the full transaction history. Then I put my phone face down on the table and stared at the window. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was perfectly still. No wind, just gray November light coming through the glass. I'd been here before, not with this exact situation, but with this feeling. The feeling of sitting quietly with information that changes everything, while the rest of the house sleeps. My name is Gerald. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. I built bridges for a living, not poetically, literally. I understand load-bearing structures. I understand the difference between what looks stable and what actually is. And I understand that when a crack appears in something that's supposed to hold weight, you don't wait to see if it gets worse. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. My wife and I met 8 years ago at a community event in the town where we both lived. She was warm and funny and direct in a way I respected immediately. She'd been widowed 4 years before we met. I'd been divorced for 6 years at that point, a long, quiet marriage that had simply run out of road. No dramatic ending, just two people who'd grown in different directions and finally admitted it. We dated for 2 years before we got married. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I wasn't rushed. I wasn't naive. I was a 60-year-old man who took his time and made a deliberate choice. I knew who I was marrying. I thought I knew what I was getting into. My wife has one adult child from her first marriage, a daughter who lives in Oregon, married, 2 kids, completely self-sufficient. We get along fine. That was never the issue. The issue was her brother. His name is Dennis. He's 54 years old. He's been, in the years I've known him, a salesman, a contractor, an investor, a consultant, and currently, as of 7 months ago, unemployed. He has a gift for describing his situation in terms that always make the next opportunity sound just around the corner. He talks about money with tremendous confidence for someone who never seems to have any. His wife left him 2 years ago. I won't get into the details because they're not mine to share, but I'll say that the people who knew them weren't surprised. After the divorce, Dennis moved into a rental in a town about 40 minutes from us. He called my wife often, more than often. She worried about him in the specific, consuming way that only older siblings worry about younger ones they've spent a lifetime protecting. I understood that. I have a younger brother myself. I know what that pull feels like. So when Dennis lost his job in April and called my wife in tears saying he couldn't make rent, I didn't argue. She looked at me across the dinner table with that expression I'd come to know, not quite asking, but close, and I said, fine. 6 weeks. He can stay in the guest room, get back on his feet, figure out his next step. 6 weeks. He moved in on a Saturday. He brought 3 suitcases and a large flat-screen television that he set up in the guest room without asking. I noticed that. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth a conversation. That was my first mistake, deciding things weren't worth a conversation. The first 2 weeks were fine, the way most things are fine at the beginning, before the reality of them sets in. Dennis was cheerful and helpful and told elaborate stories at dinner that made my wife laugh. He did the dishes a few times without being asked. He talked about job applications, phone interviews, a promising lead at a logistics company in the city. The logistics company never called back, or if it did, I never heard about it. By week 4, Dennis had settled into a rhythm that had nothing to do with job hunting and everything to do with comfort. He woke up late. He watched television in the mornings. He drove my wife's car to run errands that seemed to expand in scope and duration every time. He started buying things, nothing outrageous at first, just small purchases that showed up when I was reviewing our joint household account. A video game, a Bluetooth speaker, a pair of boots that I saw by the front door and didn't recognize. I asked my wife about the boots. She said Dennis had mentioned he needed them for an interview. The interview, as far as I could tell, never happened. I want to be honest about something here because I think it's important. I am not a confrontational man by nature. I spent 3 decades managing projects with dozens of people, navigating disagreements, negotiating timelines. I know how to address problems directly. But in my own home, with my wife's brother, I kept finding reasons to wait. I'd bring it up this weekend, after the holidays. When things settled down, I kept giving the situation just a little more time, the way you give a crack in a wall just a little more time, telling yourself it might stop spreading on its own. It didn't stop spreading. Month 2 turned into month 3. The 6-week arrangement became something no one talked about anymore. Dennis started referring to the guest room as his room. He started having friends over just once, then twice. Then it became a regular Thursday thing, where I'd come home from my part-time consulting work to find 2 or 3 men I didn't know, sitting in my living room watching football. I finally sat down with my wife and told her we needed to reset the arrangement. I wasn't angry. I was clear. I said Dennis needed to start contributing to the household something modest, a few $100s a month, and that we needed a concrete timeline for when he'd be moving out. I had numbers ready. I'd done the math. My wife listened. She nodded. She said she'd talk to him. Whatever she said, nothing changed. Dennis started contributing nothing. The Thursday gatherings continued. The purchases on the household account continued. And then, in month 5, something new started happening. I began to notice small discrepancies in my personal savings account, not the joint household account, my personal one, the one I'd had since before I remarried, the one I'd been quietly building for retirement. Small amounts at first, $30 here, $80 there. I assumed I'd forgotten something. I'm 63. I don't always remember every small transaction, but I started writing them down. Date, amount, description, the way an engineer writes things down systematically, without judgment, just observation. By the end of month 5, I had a list that added up to just over $900 in transactions I couldn't account for. I went to the bank in person. I sat across from a woman named Patricia, who had been helping me with my accounts for years. I told her I needed to understand how these withdrawals were occurring. She pulled up my account history on her screen and turned the monitor slightly so I could see. What she showed me took a moment to fully register. There were transactions being made from an ATM near our house. Regular withdrawals, never more than 200 at a time. The pattern was consistent, always on weekdays, always in the morning, always when I was at work. Patricia asked if I had a secondary card holder on the account. I told her I didn't. She checked again. There was no secondary card holder listed, but there was a linked ATM card that had been requested, not by me. I'm going to be careful here about what I say, because I don't know with complete certainty what happened or exactly how. What I know is what I found. And what I found was that somehow an ATM card connected to my personal savings account had been obtained. Not a card I requested, not a card I authorized. I kept my face very still when Patricia explained this to me. That took effort. I asked her to cancel that card immediately. I asked her to change my account number. I asked her to put a flag on any further card requests. And while I was sitting there, I made a decision that I'd been approaching slowly for weeks and finally arrived at completely. I was done waiting for things to settle down. Patricia was kind and professional. She got everything done. She handed me new account information printed on a clean slip of paper and told me to call if I needed anything else. I thanked her, folded the paper into my jacket pocket, and walked out into the November air. On the drive home, I thought about what I was going to do. I thought about the version of myself that would walk through the door and sit everyone down and have a calm, measured conversation, ask questions, hear explanations, give Dennis a chance to account for himself. I had been that version of myself for 7 months. It had cost me over $900 and a significant amount of peace. So I drove home, and I did not sit everyone down for a conversation. I walked in through the back door. My wife was upstairs. I could hear the television in the bedroom. Dennis's car was in the driveway. I went directly to the small home office off the kitchen, where I keep my files, and I spent 2 hours doing something I should have done months earlier. I reviewed everything, every account, every automatic payment, every place my personal financial information appeared in connection with our shared household. I moved what needed to be moved. I updated what needed to be updated. I created new passwords for everything, banking apps, email, all of it. I was systematic. I was thorough. I was the engineer I had spent 31 years becoming. When I was done, I closed the office door behind me and made dinner. I want to say something about that evening because I think it reveals something true about where I was emotionally. I made a full dinner, roasted chicken, vegetables, the whole thing. I set the table. I called upstairs that dinner was ready. My wife came down. Dennis came out of his room. We ate. We made conversation. Dennis told a story about something he'd seen on the news. I listened and I nodded and I refilled my water glass and I felt, for the first time in 7 months, completely calm. I wasn't performing calm. I actually felt it because I had done something. I had stopped waiting for the situation to improve on its own and I had taken the action that was mine to take. The rest would follow from that. Whatever the rest turned out to be. My wife noticed. She looked at me once during dinner with a slightly puzzled expression, the way she does when she senses something has shifted but can't identify what. I smiled at her. I meant it too. I slept well that night, better than I had in months. The next morning was a Thursday. I went to my part-time consulting work as usual and came home at 2 in the afternoon. Dennis's car was in the driveway, same as always. I went inside, hung up my coat, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Dennis came out of his room about 20 minutes later. He was wearing the boots I didn't recognize, which I found oddly specific to notice. He said hello. He opened the refrigerator and stood there looking into it for a while. Normal Thursday. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something changed in his face just briefly. Just a flicker of something, and he stepped back toward the hallway. I heard him speaking in a low voice. I wasn't trying to listen, but the kitchen is not far from the hallway, and I have good hearing for my age. I heard, "It's not going through." And then, after a pause, "I don't know. Just try it again." He came back into the kitchen and looked at me. He had a specific look, something between casual and careful. The look of a man who is deciding how to begin a conversation. He said he was having some banking trouble and asked if I knew anything about changes to accounts. I looked at him for a moment. Then I told him I had made some changes to my personal accounts. Yes. He nodded slowly. He said he thought so. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it did not look the way confrontations look in movies. There was no shouting, no one threw anything. Dennis leaned against the counter and looked at the floor for a long moment, and I could see him cycling through his options the way people do when they've been caught, running the available exits in their head. He said he could explain. I told him I wasn't interested in an explanation. I told him I was interested in the money, the amount I had documented, which I had written down on a notepad in my office, which I retrieved and placed on the kitchen counter between us. He looked at the notepad. His jaw tightened. He started to say something about a misunderstanding, about how things had gotten complicated, about how he'd been intending to put it back. I let him finish. I waited the way you wait for someone to use up their available excuses, the way you've seen it done before and recognize the shape of it. Then I told him that I needed him out of my house within 30 days. That was the end of the discussion as far as I was concerned. He left the kitchen. I heard him on the phone again, and this time I could tell from the tone that he was talking to my wife. She came downstairs 15 minutes later. I was still in the kitchen. I had my coffee. I was prepared for this conversation not with anger, not with an ultimatum, but with clarity. That was the version of myself I wanted to be in this moment. Clear, not cold, just clear. She sat down across from me. I could see that she'd been crying, or was close to it. That was hard to see. It was genuinely hard. I want to acknowledge that because I think sometimes people tell these stories as if the difficult thing is obvious and easy, and the person telling it felt nothing complicated. I didn't feel nothing complicated. I loved my wife. I married her deliberately and intentionally, and I did not want this to be happening. But it was happening, and I needed to stay clear. She asked me if I was sure about what I thought had happened. I told her yes, I was sure, and I explained what I had found at the bank, the card, the withdrawal pattern, the dates. I was specific. I had the notepad. I slid it across to her. She looked at it for a long time. She said Dennis had told her he'd borrowed some money from my account once, just once, because he'd been embarrassed to ask me directly. He hadn't meant to take more than that. Things had gotten away from him. I asked her if she knew about this. She said no. Then she looked at the notepad again, and she said, not exactly. I sat with that answer for a moment. Not exactly. What it meant, as she explained it slowly, and with a visible difficulty that I believed was genuine, was that Dennis had told her he'd borrowed a small amount once. She hadn't asked follow-up questions. She hadn't wanted to create conflict. She had told herself it was a one-time thing, and he would handle it. I understood the human mechanics of that. I understood how denial works, and the particular protective blindness that can exist between siblings. I understood all of that. But I also understood that it changed something between us. Not destroyed, I don't think it destroyed anything, but changed. Because there is a specific kind of trust that lives in a marriage. The kind that says my person will not allow harm to come to me even when the harm is coming from their own family. And that trust had been strained in a way that would take time to address. I told her all of that. Not harshly, clearly. The way I told her everything that day. The conversation lasted 2 hours. At some point, Dennis came back into the kitchen and tried to insert himself into it. And I told him, quietly but with a firmness I was proud of, that this conversation was between my wife and me and that he should go back to his room. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then he went. That was, in its own small way, important. By the end of the 2 hours, we had agreed on the following. Dennis would have 30 days to find other accommodations. During those 30 days, he would have no access to any account connected to our household. My wife would communicate the repayment arrangement to him, not in installments over some vague future timeline, but with a written agreement and a clear schedule. I had drafted the language for it while she and I talked. I had it on my phone. She asked me if I was going to be able to forgive her. I told her that forgiveness wasn't the right word for what I needed from her. What I needed was for us to agree, going forward, that my financial security, the security I had spent 31 years building, was not available for others to draw from without my knowledge and consent. That the boundary I had failed to establish clearly enough at the beginning needed to be established clearly now. And that the next time she could see something difficult approaching, she would bring it to me instead of managing it alone in the hope that it would resolve. She said yes. She said it like someone who had been sitting with something heavy for a long time and was relieved to set it down. Dennis moved out 26 days later. He found a room in a house that several men rented together in a town about 20 miles away. He was pleasant enough on the day he left. He thanked my wife, he shook my hand, and I shook his, because I am 63 years old and I am not interested in carrying unnecessary weight. But I did not offer to help him move. He came back twice in the following month, once for something he'd forgotten, once for a reason I couldn't quite identify, just showing up on a Sunday afternoon. The second time, I answered the door and I was polite and I did not invite him in. We had a brief conversation on the porch. I wished him well. He left. My wife and I have spent the months since then rebuilding something. It's not the same as before, and I don't think it should be. What we're building now is more honest than what we had. We talk about money directly. We talk about family directly. We have had harder conversations in the past 8 months than we had in the previous 6 years of our marriage, and I think we are better for it. The repayment agreement is being honored for whatever it's worth. Slowly. $200 a month. I didn't expect it to happen quickly, and it isn't. What I think about most when I think about all of this is not the money. The money was significant, I won't pretend otherwise, but it was recoverable. What I think about most is that 6-week conversation we had at the beginning when I said, fine, I understand. He can stay for a little while and get back on his feet. I meant it. I wasn't wrong to mean it. Helping people you care about is not weakness. The weakness was in the follow-through. The failure to revisit the agreement when the 6 weeks ended. The decision, repeated across 7 months, that the discomfort of a direct conversation was larger than the cost of avoiding it. I am a man who understands load-bearing structures. I spent 31 years calculating what something could hold before it gave way. And I let myself forget, in my own home, that agreements need to be maintained the same way bridges do. That neglect accumulates. That small cracks become something larger, not because of any dramatic event, but because of slow, compounding inattention. The morning I drove to the bank and sat across from Patricia and had everything changed, that was the moment I stopped being inattentive. I don't say this to sound like someone who learned a tidy lesson. Real life doesn't deliver tidy lessons. What I have now is a marriage that is more direct than it was, a guest room that is empty and going to stay that way, and a personal savings account that I check with my own eyes every single day. That is enough for me. There is one more thing I want to say, and I want to say it carefully. If you are in a situation where someone is drawing from what you have built, your money, your time, your energy, your peace, and you have been waiting for the right moment to address it, I want to tell you something that took me 7 months and more than $900 to learn. The right moment was the first moment. It was the first time the 6 weeks became 8 weeks without a conversation. It was the first time the boots appeared by the door and you decided not to ask. It was the first time the small withdrawal showed up and you told yourself you must have forgotten. It was every one of those moments, and you can't go back to them, and that's all right. But you are at a moment right now, whatever form it takes in your life, and the cost of addressing it today is smaller than the cost of addressing it 3 months from now. That I can tell you with complete confidence because I am an engineer and I understand how loads accumulate. I drove home from the bank that November morning with a piece of paper in my jacket pocket and the first clear plan I'd had in months. The oak tree in the backyard was still when I got home. The house was quiet. I went to my office and I did what needed to be done. And then I made dinner.